I'm a big believer in the notion that evil happens not because of evil people, but because good people do nothing. And every time we see one of these big scandals, it becomes very evident that lots of people knew what was going on but didn't do anything about it.
Building a successful real estate career requires you to adapt, pivot, and constantly master new skills.
We're Katie and Daniel Steinfeld. We've built our own innovative brokerage, and in this podcast, we've assembled actionable tips and strategies that you can implement to take your business to its maximum potential.
It's time to level up. Level up. Level up.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope you are all doing well. We're going to wait. I'm sure there'll be a few people filing in as we get on with the conversation, but we'll get started and you guys can catch up with the conversation. Today, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Wendy Cukier to the program. She is a professor of the Toronto Metropolitan University and the leader of the Diversity Institute. And we are so happy to have her on. This is a conversation we've been wanting to have for a while. I know it's something that we've spoken about with many of you over the last little while, just in terms of the things that we are seeing in the industry, specifically around racism, and just how we can be better and be better allies and just work to make sure that our industry feels as safe as possible for everyone. And so we couldn't think of a better person to welcome than Wendy. So Wendy, welcome and thank you for coming on today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's, the Diversity Institute has been around for a number of years, and we focus on really looking at ways to help organizations, industries tap into talent, markets, and so on. And I didn't know a ton about real estate except as a consumer. And what was so interesting to me is that on the one hand, the industry has one of the highest levels of mobility in that, it really is entirely dependent on your level of talent. There are not huge barriers to entry as long as you pass the exam. And if you can sell, you can be successful. And as a result, we see, lots of women, including my real estate agent, becoming millionaires at a level that is far beyond what we see in other sectors. We see opportunities for newcomers, many of them racialized and so on, because it is so driven by performance. On the other hand, we do, as you mentioned, Katie, see challenges around both the experience of real estate agents working with each other and in brokerages, but more often working with clients or particularly financial institutions. And so it's a really interesting industry from our perspective. And because we're so focused on entrepreneurship, I would argue that real estate agents are the quintessential entrepreneurs. So huge opportunities to, I think, make the sector better.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, Daniel, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sorry, it froze on me for a second there, but I couldn't agree more. And I think this is why it's so important that we have this conversation, not just today, but hopefully this is a spark for a lot of people that get people thinking beyond just what they see in media or what they think, the quote unquote right answer is. Because like you said, there's so much going on in terms of the number of people and the number of experiences people have. And it really is representative in a lot of ways of society because of so many different relationships that are taking place within the industry, like you said, and then also with our own clients and the people we work alongside outside of the industry. So I guess at the risk of being too broad, because there's so many kind of broad 10,000 foot questions, but maybe starting with that, what are the sorts of big ticket item things you see in industries like ours that are, I guess, becoming a bit of a red flag, or the items that merit discussion as it relates to common forms of racism and discrimination, things like that in our industry and in general in business?
Well, I think, obviously the first barrier was for women, women in the industry. And in fact, we still find that women sometimes don't get the same level of support, mentoring, training, coaching, connections, and so on that their men colleagues do, depending on the brokerage firm, depending on the structure. We also know, and this is a sad state of affairs, but women also feel more vulnerable and unsafe. If you think about the processes that are involved, at least pre-COVID, with selling homes, where you have to go to places on your own with strangers. There's a whole dimension of being a woman in real estate that is quite different than being a man. And we know, for instance, in commercial real estate, women are particularly underrepresented. At the same time, as I said at the outset, just look at the winner's circles that are advertised, and you see a lot of women at the top of their field, and increasingly in associations and so on. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. When you think about racialized people, it's important to understand there's a real difference between the experience, for instance, of someone who is of Chinese origin versus someone who is Black, and the nature of their experiences. Again, some really shining examples of success from different ethnic groups and agents, partly because markets are changing so dramatically. So if you think about it, half the population in Toronto is racialized. Half the population in Toronto was born outside of Canada. And as a result, that creates huge opportunities for agents. This is a cat.
I saw it in the background.
for agents to capitalize on their knowledge of culture and customs and communication styles and so on. On the other hand, we know that racialized agents often report experiences of racism at the hands of their colleagues, but just as often they observe racism in how their clients are treated by banks, how properties are evaluated. There was just a study that came out recently that said that Black property owners tend to receive lower valuations on their properties when they're trying to sell. So it's not just agents who experience the problems, it's also your clients and your customers. At the same time, we can see that diversity can really be a strength in breaking into new markets and growing business. It goes without saying that people who are identify as LGBTQ2S+, especially in some communities, smaller communities, more so than large metropolitan centers, often face homophobia. And there are also property owners who will refuse to lease property to gay couples, for example. So it's both on the supply and the demand side that we see issues. And of course, Indigenous peoples have a particular set of barriers, partly because half live on reserve, where they don't really have property in the traditional sense that we would think of it. It's communal property typically. And so when they go outside of their community to try to invest or purchase property, they don't have the same set of assets or the track record that someone who lived in a big city might have. So Indigenous peoples also face challenges both as consumers, and they're very underrepresented in the sector. And if we look at persons with disabilities, again, it's clear that while talent can trump everything, accessibility issues and so on can also play a factor. So I always look at issues around diversity and inclusion as opportunities as well as challenges, because as markets are changing, the more understanding you have of people who are different from you, the more successful you will be. As the population is changing, if you're trying to build the talent pool, if you're trying to attract and retain people to the industry, you've got to create inclusive and safe environments, and maybe rethink some of the ways that businesses operated in the past.
So much great stuff, and so many questions that just came from all of that. One thing I always struggle with, and I hope some of the questions I might ask aren't coming across as, they might just come across as naive or what have you, but I find there's a fine line between understanding different cultures and backgrounds and their styles of communication, their styles of negotiating, their styles of doing business, versus stereotyping those people and seeing them as a different background and making assumptions based on what you see. And so do you have any, I guess, tips or ways to kind of understand where people are coming from based on their background, but also making sure that we're not just fitting them into a box or, stereotyping them?
Hugely important question. And one of the reasons why this is always so challenging. And I mean, the best thing to do is ask. Don't make an assumption. One of the things, and I'm of a particular generation where, people talked about husbands and wives all the time, for example. We're now in a space where that's no longer appropriate. So there are ways in which you can use language and you can treat people that don't make assumptions about what their, marital status, sexual orientation, racial background, and so on might be. We see a lot of second, third generation racialized people who are constantly asked where they're from. The answer is Scarborough or Etobicoke. And so it is really difficult space to navigate. But I think most real estate agents have very highly developed communication skills, intuition, ability to read people, and asking questions without making assumptions, I think is really key. The other thing we know is there are patterns. So certain ethnic groups are more likely, for example, to want multi-generational homes, but you can't always assume that's the case. So I think being well educated on some of these issues, asking questions, and really becoming aware of your own unconscious biases or assumptions that may get in the way of your success. Like, I learn every day about something that I have taken for granted that is simply no longer appropriate. I spent over 30 years trying to advance women in technology. Well, now there's a big focus on rethinking how we construct gender and getting rid of notions of men versus women, making space for people who are non-binary or identify in different ways. For someone in my age group, that's really quite a different way of thinking, but we have to constantly adapt. I mean, who would have thought in this, 10 years ago, that the big topics of discussion in many organizations are around, unisex bathrooms or accommodation of gender reassignment surgery and so on in benefits packages. Like, the world constantly changes, and I think in an industry where understanding consumers and consumer demand is key to your success, diversity and inclusion should just be part of everything you do.
100%. I think that's the best way to put it. Is we talk so much in this industry about, whether it's knowing your client or knowing the industry or the product and researching. That is just a key pillar of what that represents. It's not just what's a house worth or what does this neighborhood look like or things like that. It's how is the construct of society changing and the people that we deal with, and the list is a long one. And I think if I were to take a step back, and I really want to dive into some of the tangible approaches we can and should be taking for someone who's very new to the concept, or maybe just uncomfortable with the concept of the fact that the world is changing, which is a lot of people, right? Or people who are just unaware. Where, when we talk about educating and kind of building your own mindset first, before you start, like, you need to be comfortable with what you know and what you want to know before you start telling and asking other people necessarily. What is it that I would do as someone who's really trying to embrace diversity and trying to understand the way, people should be interacting and could be interacting in a perfect world? What's that starting point for people in terms of educating themselves?
Yeah, there are lots of different different ways you can approach it. A lot depends on what kind of learner you are. Very often real estate agents are independent learners. They do self-study. They don't necessarily like to go to class and so on. So, there are lots and lots of online courses, or things you can read that just give you, or podcasts and webinars and YouTube videos that can help acquaint you with just some of the basic concepts around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Why are we so preoccupied right now with truth and reconciliation? I'm embarrassed to say how little I knew about the history of genocide in Canada. But when I studied history, there was a very different framing of Indigenous peoples, and there was no talk of, how settlers gave them blankets laced with smallpox. Just in the last couple of years, my own appreciation of the extent to which we have a lot to account for in Canada has increased dramatically. So, reading is one way. There are more structured courses. I know that TREB is working, for example, in the Toronto region on specialized training. I think OREA has stuff as well. The different your real estate boards and agencies often have programs that are designed to give you some basic EDI training. I think for me the biggest thing is adopting a growth mindset and recognizing that the world is changing and that we have to continuously learn and adapt and understand. And for me, one of the most eye-opening things was I took the Harvard implicit bias test. It's online, you can take it, you can pick categories. You can look at women in technology, you can look at your attitudes to Black people and so on. I have worked for 30 years promoting women in technology. When I took the Harvard implicit bias test, it showed when I am made to make decisions quickly, I associate men with science and technology, women with arts and culture. That is so deeply embedded in my psyche that in spite of everything I've studied and talked about with respect to women in technology, I still have these instincts that if I'm pushed quickly, I will make assumptions. And so really trying to understand that becomes important. I think understanding privilege is important. And a lot of times that's, they talk about white privilege. I actually think that race certainly does confer a certain level of privilege. Like if I go into Holt Renfrew, no one's going to follow me around. I've never been kicked out of a coffee shop because I wasn't purchasing something. I just wanted to use the washroom or I was standing around. I've never been pulled over by the police for no reasons. Like my lived experience as a white person is with a good education parents who were supportive and so on. It's completely different than the experience of someone else. But there are other dimensions of privilege, right? I grew up quite poor. My father died when I was young. My mother was a medical secretary. I didn't know about what opportunities were in terms of employment. I didn't know which fork to use. I didn't know how to network or hang out with, rich people. And so, you can go through a whole set of your own experiences and start to really think about how your experience is different than someone else's experience. I've never had to worry about publicly expressing affection to my partner. What would it be like to spend your whole life concealing your sexual orientation, etc.? So, for me, it starts fundamentally with self-awareness, and then also this idea, that both of us have talked about, which is thinking about your clients and trying to understand your clients, and recognizing that everybody is unique and different, and you've got to try to get inside their heads. And the more aware you are of some of these dimensions of diversity, the better able you will be to make money.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important, because I think, especially when it comes to privilege, I think there's a lot of embarrassment and shame that people hold. Like it's like they don't even want to admit it. But it's more, as you said, that awareness piece, and just recognizing that this is my experience and I've had privilege due to the fact that I'm white or that I'm in a certain socioeconomic class. And so I think if people can just shift their mindset, as you said, that will just change so much. And even in real estate, as you said, when you're dealing with your clients, if you're working with somebody from a different culture or background, recognizing probably the different experiences that they've lived to date, and how long it's taken them to get to the moment of probably purchasing their first home. It's taken them longer because of all of the stuff that they've encountered through their life. So I just think that's such an eye-opening thought, and just so many things to think about with that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm happy to provide some of these resources after the fact if it would be of interest. But we actually worked with an agency called Zulu Alpha Kilo, which is brilliant. And other partners to develop something called the Micropedia on microaggressions. And that's something else that people have only come to be more aware of recently. And that is how unintentional use of language or interactions can really deeply offend or hurt or make people feel less than. And, I know certainly as a woman who was in non-traditional industries for a long time, I know what a microaggression looks like when it's directed at women, and many women have the experience of sitting around a table, they say something, no one pays any attention, a guy says the same thing, everyone goes, oh, what a great idea. I've had bosses who in a room crowded of industry colleagues would yell out, hey, blondie, things like, when my first job, there were like sunshine girls on the wall, and the men talked about everybody's bodies. And the only time they took me out for lunch was to a strip joint to see how I would behave. So I know what microaggression looks like, but what I have become more aware of is how microaggressions feel for people who aren't like me. For instance, I was talking to a Black woman that I know very well who, I wonder if I'm still on. Sorry, not sure who dropped off, but I'm back. Katie, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't know where Daniel went either. We're all, that's weird. Okay, well, we're still, oh, there he is.
Oh, there's Daniel.
So weird. We all just kind of
I was just talking about how microaggressions are often unintentional. I knew my boss really liked me, but he didn't understand how it would feel for being me, one of the few women in the contacts, to be called blondie, given all the associations that blondes have, which are not necessarily a PhD in information technology. So but it wasn't until I talked to other colleagues, like a friend who is a Black woman, who said, the number of times people would say to her, "My, you're articulate," with the subtext being, "For someone like you." And the first time she said it, I sort of thought, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. And then I heard a Black woman politician say exactly the same thing. A pattern in how we treat people who are Black, particularly Black women. I have offended people, I'm sure, deeply by coming up and stroking their hair, right? And if that is a thing that is incredibly offensive to many. I was never aware of it. I wasn't trying to be unfriendly. I was actually trying to be friendly. But there are lots of small things like that, gestures, asking people where they're from when they were born in Canada and speak for perfect English, asking people what their native tongue was when they may have an accent, but they were educated at a top university in English in India. It's that kind of stuff that's a little more amorphous and hard to get your head around, but you have to constantly be aware of the fact that it doesn't really matter what you intend. What matters is how people feel as a result of what you're saying or doing.
Absolutely. Like the irony, like you said, is that a lot of times, not all, but a lot of times these microaggressions are a function of something where you're actually trying to be nice. You're trying to achieve the opposite of the outcome that you likely to this point, and like you said, I'm sure we do it every day still. And the more aware, I guess all we can do is try to be more aware and try to ask the questions and not assume. But it's a really interesting thought, because in some ways, I think a worry people have with this overall topic, and this as a subtopic to that, is people kind of get now they switch into being over defensive, right? Because, well, now what can I say? What can I do? Because when I'm trying to be nice, it's not nice. If I'm not nice, it's not nice. Everything's not nice, right? So, and that's wrong. I think people need to kind of give their head a shake, take a step back and say, well, no, understand things more and don't just jump into the answer.
It was one of the unintended consequences of the Me Too movement, right? Is that a lot of senior men just said, oh, I don't want to put myself in a vulnerable situation, so I will never have dinner with a woman colleague. I will stay
Women
away.
are out now.
I will
Sorry.
never have coffee with a woman colleague. I will never put myself in a position where I might be jeopardized. And so, it's definitely really, really complicated, but the fact is it's important. And as I just keep coming back to the idea that, if your success is dependent on your relations with people, and if the people are changing, you clearly have to be, at the forefront of some of this thinking if you're going to be successful.
Definitely. I think what a lot of us in the industry face as well is just seeing our own clients, especially when it comes to rental properties. If we're working with a landlord, very obvious racist comments. And obviously, that makes it awkward for us working with those people. It would make it a heck of a lot more awkward for the person, and obviously a lot more hurtful for the person that's experiencing that racism. But can you recommend any approaches, or is it just basically calling it out, and whatever their reaction is, it's kind of like that's their problem type thing, and we just choose not to work with racist people? Like, is that the answer?
Well, it's a real challenge. And, as in your industry, like the analogy that I think of is, in a work environment, there are power structures. And if you see your boss do something that's offensive, you take a risk if you call them out publicly. You take a risk if you confront them. On the other hand, you take a risk if you become a a bystander, because really that, I'm a big believer in the notion that evil happens not because of evil people, but because good people do nothing. And every time we see one of these big scandals, it becomes very evident that lots of people knew what was going on but didn't do anything about it. So I think, I'm not the diversity police. I think people have to decide where to draw the boundaries. I mean, one of the strategies that might depersonalize it, for example, is if in the contracts that agents sign with clients, you have really clear non-discrimination clauses in there referencing legal obligations under the Human Rights Act. Then it's not about you calling them out. It's baked into, we are subject to laws, we are subject to the Human Rights Code. It is a violation to refuse somebody accommodation because of their race, their creed, their gender, and so on. So that might be a way to kind of reduce the burden on individuals, try to bake into the system more clarity around expectations. The other thing that a very smart woman explained to me on a panel we were on once is there's a difference between calling out and calling in. So calling out is where you stop and you draw attention to the behavior in a public way. And sometimes that's necessary. Calling in is you take someone aside and you have a private conversation with them in an effort to change their mind or their behavior. And a lot depends on your relationship with the person and the power structures that you find yourselves in. But that's something also to really think about is how you deliver messages that may be unwelcome to clients. And I mean, real estate agents do that all the time. Mine walked in, looked around my house and said, it's a tear down. Crushed my little spirit. Stabbed me in the heart. But, real estate agents have to tell people stuff they don't want to hear all the time. So, there may be ways to come up with strategies for dealing with some of those issues. And also, sometimes evidence doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. And we know in many cases, people are making assumptions about what kind of tenants these people will be based on stereotypes and so on. And sometimes, showing that those assumptions are wrong could be really, really helpful. I mean, landlords want money, right? So, renting a place to a racialized professional may actually be one of the best business decisions you make.
Yeah. Well, I think it's amazing because we do go through the contracts and the boilerplate stuff with clients, but you're right. It's baked into the agreement in such a way that we talk a lot about setting expectations and ground rules as we begin a relationship with any new client, especially those of whom we don't have pre-existing relationships with, because we want to work with people we're comfortable with as well. I don't want to generalize because this is people's livelihood and there's a lot of people out there who will take whoever rings their phone, right? And hopefully they're good people. But being able to establish that on the onset and really not saying, hey, you better not be a racist or I'm not working with you, like not that, but to your point, there's a certain understanding in the relationship we have with our clients. And if there's a situation where things are going to be uncomfortable or get uncomfortable, it's easier to address it quickly when you've already established the way you're going to work together. And whether that's within the rules that are in the contract or just the way you work and the type of person you are, that's really helpful. In a situation like that, like what Katie was talking about, this is kind of blending two things, and it's another gray area where we witness clients of ours, let's say, who might be racialized. So let's say the landlord, or let's say we're working with a seller who is from a certain background, and there's people offering on their property who are from the same background. And the person we're dealing with is generalizing or making comments about the person on the other side of the table. However, in some sense, they're speaking from an experience that maybe, you know, it's more at home experience than what we have, but still sounds inappropriate, right? Because it doesn't make it right. How do you, or do you, address those sorts of situations where it seems like someone's speaking from a greater background of knowledge, but it still sounds wrong?
Racist. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's so interesting because there is a difference between cross-cultural knowledge and understanding that, for example, the style of bargaining and deal making in some cultures is very different than the style in others. I remember the first time I went to China, and fortunately I had a colleague with me who was Chinese, and I went to a meeting and we had a discussion, and I could not understand what had happened. Do we have an agreement? Do we not have an agreement? You know, do they like me? Do they hate me? Is this moving forward? Because the nuances and the subtleties of the interaction were so alien to my style of interaction and knowledge. And I was fortunate because my colleague was able to say, oh no, it was good, you know, but you have to recognize that building these relationships is very different than in North America. It's going to be 10 dinners before you get to yes, as opposed to a 5-minute conversation. So, you know, there's definitely cultural differences that are well established, well documented in terms of, you know, whether people are bargaining or whether the price is the price, that sort of thing. I think it's hard to argue that someone is racist against their own community, although I suppose it's possible that that happens. But, you know, again, sometimes questioning or challenging, but in a gentle way, you know, oh, can you explain that to me? Because that doesn't sound right to me. You know, I am not skilled at these things. I'm the first to admit that I make mistakes all the time, but it seems to me that that's the kind of thing that you can do, is just, well, what do you really mean by that? You know, because to me that sounds like this. Maybe what you mean is whatever. Trying to reframe might be a way to keep the relationship developing, but also signal that, you know, you're not real comfortable with the way things are being presented.
That's great. So just as being conscious of time and your time, we want to make sure that if anybody does have any questions on the Facebook group right now, you can jump in and we'll wrap it up. But as my final question, I just wanted to understand a little bit. One thing I've been struggling with myself is just ensuring that with whatever we do, whether it's the podcast interviews or bringing professionals to speak to our brokerage or even our agents, ensuring that there's always diversity and that we're seeing a different mix of people is really, really important. But sometimes I find, and I wonder if other people struggle with this, you know, it kind of feels weird to search out people from different backgrounds, you know, because you're not meaning to get them to participate. Yeah, like you don't want to do it because of their background. You want to do it because they're also professionals and they can speak well on the subject. So is it just getting over that and just always, like, I guess once you do that,
honestly,
yeah.
I think it is. I think one of the things that I think we have to be really careful about is making the assumption that because someone is Black, they want to speak on behalf of the Black community. They want to speak about their experience as a Black person, because sometimes they just want you to treat them like a real estate agent. That being said, real estate agents are diverse. You just need to look at the top listers. And so, or the top performers. So, I do think that we tend to rely on our social networks, and we tend to hang out with people who are like us. And so it may take a bit more effort or a bit more work to find someone who is not like you. But, I think that you build the pool, and you overcome your lack of comfort. And it's just really important not to assume, as I said, that some people want to speak based on their identity, especially people who have been discriminated against. I mean, I know a very prominent lawyer who I knew was Indigenous because he was a student at Ryerson, who had never disclosed his Indigenous identity as he was moving up. As he was in law school, he didn't take the benefits that he could have got as an Indigenous student, or as he was scaling the legal profession. He never divulged his Indigenous identity until after the Kamloops discovery of unmarked graves. And that was sort of the event that led him to be willing to self-identify. But I know people, my vintage, who I know are gay or lesbian, who will not, under any circumstances, divulge their identity publicly or speak about those aspects of their identity. So it's such a personal thing that it's sometimes not easy. And I think before you put someone on a podcast and start grilling them about what's it like to be a Black person in real estate, you want to make sure that they're comfortable talking about whatever the thing is that you're trying to get them to talk about. But if you're bringing someone on to talk about, sales or housing trends, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation are not necessarily issues. So there's sort of two ways of addressing it: just trying to get experts who are diverse, and not because you want them to talk about their identity, but then also trying to get people who might want to talk about their lived experience in order to help others understand more about how to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, for instances like the lawyer who didn't disclose that they're Indigenous, or situations like that, is it, and maybe it's different for everybody, is it because they don't want that to become what defines them beyond what they've built for themselves? Or is it more I'm afraid of what this might mean and what people think of me once they learn this?
I think it's both. Like, there's some women, and I'm sure Katie's met them too, who absolutely don't want any discussion of what it's like to be a woman or gender, because I made it, I'm as good as anybody else, quit whining. There are definitely people like that. I like to crush them, but it's and often when you look, I was on a panel with one woman who was like an heiress, talking about how she had never had any barriers to her climb to the top of the company she inherited. And it's like, yeah, okay. But so, sometimes there's that people have worked really hard to get where they are, and they don't want their identity to be to result in them being treated tokenistically, like, oh yeah, you got there because. But in this particular instance, and in many other instances, it's fear of reprisal, it's fear of discrimination. And this particular lawyer said to me, the reason he didn't apply for the support that he could have gotten through law school was because he watched how Indigenous students who identified as Indigenous were being treated. And it was a way of protecting himself. There's something called discouraged borrower syndrome. We see it with healthcare, we see it with financial institutions, we see it with educational institutions, where people's deep experience of racism or bias, or their observations of racism and bias and discrimination, lead them to expect to be badly treated in those environments if they self-identify. And there's something to it. If you like, we have the evidence. So sometimes people just don't want the baggage that goes. We see it a lot with people who have mental health issues or cognitive differences or invisible disabilities concealing their identity. We see it a lot with Muslims. One of my students did research, interviewed someone. There was a guy who was a financial wizard on Bay Street, used to go out drinking with his buddies every Friday night. He told them he didn't drink because he was recovering alcoholic, because he didn't want them to know he was Muslim. So we see a lot of evidence of people concealing their identity in order to avoid being discriminated against, because they're aware of what happens to people who do identify.
Yeah, so much to process,
Honestly,
and so much to understand.
I was going to say, we could talk for like the next 5-6 hours. We should make this a multi-volume.
Yeah,
because I do have a ton more
think
questions.
about people who change their names, right? Especially you see it a lot with Chinese people who, if they grew up in Hong Kong, they have a Christian name or an English name. And so for their whole life, they're called Joe when that's not their name. I mean, the steps that people will take to try to avoid being discriminated against or inconveniencing people is quite remarkable, and it tells us there's a long way to go. Yeah,
there really is. But I think you brought so much great knowledge and perspective to this conversation. Like for me, just taking away, making less assumptions is really important. Understanding your own privilege and just being more self-aware and thoughtful with every interaction that you have, I think are good, probably first steps to take as you kind of navigate through this. And as you said, like, no matter how long you've been doing this and like understanding this, like there's always so much more to learn, and the world is changing all the time. So we're constantly forced to adapt, but that's a good thing. And so we need to embrace that. But thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. We really, really appreciate it. And we'll make sure to share some of the notes that you had, like the Harvard implicit bias test sounds like a really great one to take. I'd be curious to do that. But as we wrap up, is there anything else that we might have missed, or anything you wanted to mention in terms of the Diversity Institute at all?
No, I'm really pleased to have been included. And, we're continuing to work with a number of different real estate organizations to develop training materials and other tools for anyone on the call who is actually in a management position or works in a brokerage firm. The Diversity Institute also has tools for small businesses on how to really bake these principles into their processes. So happy to have people reach out if they want access to more resources. Happy to provide you with a cheat list of things, and would be very grateful if you would share them widely.
Absolutely. We did actually, I know we're wrapping up, but we did just get a question, because that's how it works. Post conclusion. But it's an interesting question because we didn't touch on it. And Christine's asking about age discrimination. And she says that seems to be something that's moving up the ladder a bit more in terms of, and maybe it's always been something, but I guess it's something that now also merits discussion as something that people don't talk about as much. Would you say that that's another area that is maybe not picking up steam, but just a big
massive one? And as I have reached an age where I get reduced subway tickets, you see it all. Sorry, and this is political, but I'll say it anyways. Lisa LaFlamme getting turfed by CTV at the age of 58, in spite of the rankings of her shows. Like most women my age just gasped in horror. And you see it. You see older women being devalued, in part because, often appearance is such a big piece of of historically how women have been valued. So I mean, for sure we see it. I don't have evidence, but my guess is there's still people who assume that women don't have the resources, the assets, the capability to invest that men do. If someone's dealing with a couple, especially an older couple, maybe they're going to focus much more on what the man thinks because they assume that the man is a decision maker. We also know that accessibility issues with the aging population, features in homes that provide more accessibility, even simple things like shower bars and maybe not ramps, but stairs that are not going to kill you if you slip and fall. So again, it's both on the supply and the demand side that we see challenges to older women in the workplace on multiple levels, and we see challenges to older Canadians in terms of the kind of accommodation. I would say, and I did talk about older women, because I do feel that the discrimination against women as they age is more acute than men. As men get older with gray hair, they're wiser, they're knowledgeable, and often age and wisdom are connected when we think about men, less so when we think about women.
I'm still hoping that age helps me out in the looks department. There's still time.
It will help us all. All right. Well, that was a great question, and I think very timely given the departure, or that's a nicer word. How do we put it? The kicking out of Lisa Laflamme, because that was a big thing, and I think a lot of people feel. One more question to wrap that up. So I have been seeing a lot of comments and assumptions on that. Is that okay? I agree with that. I think that she was it had a lot to do with age, because you don't see that with a lot of senior men anchors, the way they're treated. So I think it's
75-year-olds who can barely talk.
Only when the men are caught in a scandal is when they get that's when they get let
right.
go.
Yeah.
Something they have to have done something terrible and get it found out after 30 years of silence.
Right.
That's when they get kicked out.
Yeah, but when Lisa Laflamme with the gray hair, I remember there was so much conversation about that, her hair. You would never have men would never deal with that. Men, they're aging gracefully, they're getting the silver streaks, and all of a sudden they're full gray hair
or no hair.
Oh, no hair. Nobody's talking about that yet. Women, it's oh my God, this is a whole story that we have to. Yeah, it's ridiculous. So. All right.
But it is, to me, I actually, in the circles that I travel in, I've seen quite a lot of chatter about it. I don't think, and especially because she was completely blindsided, it wasn't a sort of planned transition session where she so I think it looks pretty bad. And certainly the reaction among women, as I said, of my vintage was, oh my God, how could this happen? And in this day and age. So it's the stereotypes and biases are so deeply ingrained in our society. You really have to constantly stop and think and question your assumptions and what's going on around you and what's really underlying it. And for me, that's just a very raw case that I think is going to be discussed for a while.
I think you're right. Yeah. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate your time. This is such a great conversation. And if you guys missed this, you can go back to the recording, or it will be our podcast for next week. So we will make sure to share that, and as well as all of the resources from the Diversity Institute. A lot of great information there. So thanks again, Wendy. We appreciate your time.
Really appreciate being included. Love your industry. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Never level up.